So welcome everyone to our actual last WEFI of the fall. Look out for a call for papers pretty soon. We'll send that out shortly. We're excited to have Jen giving this talk today, and then Tong's going to be discussing. Couple logistics just to make sure we're all on the same page. Jen's going to talk for about 40 minutes, then Tong will talk for about 15, and then we will have time at the end for Q&A, but we'll also try to incorporate some questions throughout the talk. Jen's co-author is unfortunately not able to be here today, so go ahead and put your questions you have in the chat or interrupt Jen, but we'll answer them throughout the talk or at the end. All right, Jen, go ahead and take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be presenting this work today. This is joint work with Tamar Ostrom, who's at Ohio State University. And the focus of our paper is on the drivers and consequences of representation in product development. Now, it's well established that innovation is a key driver of improvements in healthcare outcomes. However, the types of technologies that are developed have been shown to disproportionately affect specific sociodemographic groups. For example, research has shown that the types of cancers that disproportionately affect white patients, such as breast cancer, are more likely to receive funding than those affecting Black patients, such as colorectal cancer. And in this paper, we're going to examine another aspect of innovation, how technologies are developed. And in particular, we're going to ask, to what extent is there underrepresentation in the innovation process? How does this affect product adoptions? And importantly, what policies can address these gaps? We're going to be focusing on clinical trials. So clinical trials are used by firms to generate information about a drug's safety and efficacy, and data from these trials are used to support regulatory approval and to guide subsequent treatment decisions. Now, a key input into clinical trials are patients. For drug manufacturers, it's a really important decision to decide the types of patients that they would like to target and enroll in their clinical trials. Now, they're ensuring representation where the composition of trial participants matches the population disease burden certainly has benefits. This includes developing products that might match better with the end users of the products, and this might lead to increased adoption by those products. This is particularly important if we think that there is heterogeneity and drug treatment effects, and users in the target market are more likely to trust products that are developed on users that look like them or populations that look like them. However, there are certainly costs. There might be complicated logistics to identify these groups, and this might require additional time to build trust among specific end users that might have more of a troubled history with the medical system. And there's been growing evidence of this so-called representation problem in clinical trials. So the article on the left indicates that half of HIV patients are women. Most research subjects are men. Article on the right indicates that Blacks are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease as whites, but they are underrepresented in medical research. Now, in addition to underrepresentation by gender and race, there's also underrepresentation of certain ages. This article examines underrepresentation of elderly in clinical trials, noting that older people aren't adequately represented in trials for cancer, diabetes, and osteoporosis. And the challenge here and the problem here is that you end up with a very homogeneous group in your trials that is not representative of your real-world patients. Now, there are many factors that might shape underrepresentation of specific groups in the R&D system. So participants might be unwilling to enroll in trials due to lack of trust in the medical system. There's been really fantastic work showing how systematic racism contributes to the lack of trust by Black Americans in the medical system. Some patients may be concerned that physicians may rely on stereotypes, which could lead to suboptimal care. And more broadly, patient groups may have additional efficacy and safety concerns about the type of care that they would receive in trials. Finally, and this is what I'll be focusing on this talk, there's been growing evidence that financial barriers deter patient enrollment. For example, in describing the problem of underrepresentation of the elderly in clinical trials, the Clinton administration noted that uncertainty regarding reimbursement often deters patients from participating in these trials and deters physicians and other clinicians from recruiting patients, contributing to the low participation rates and slowing the development of new medical treatments and diagnostic tests. So with this motivation, in this paper, we're going to first document representation disparities in clinical research. Our focus is going to be on the representation of elderly, those aged 65 and older. Then we're going to examine the causal impact of reducing financial barriers on representation. Our approach here is going to be to leverage a policy, in particular a Medicare policy in 2000, that essentially lowered the clinical trial costs for the elderly. Now, the benefits of increased representation in R&D are most compelling if they actually shape product utilization and patient outcomes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to examine how changes in representation might impact drug utilizations amongst individuals most impacted by the memorandum. And finally, we're going to explore mechanisms. We want to understand what links the relationship between higher representation and product adoption. And what we find is that we find significant underrepresentation of the elderly across diseases before 2000. We see that policies that reduce financial barriers can meaningfully increase representation. We see an increase in clinical trials in affected diseases by 24%. Firms, in response to this policy, increased the number of trials with enrollment criteria also targeted towards the elderly, and also increased the number of elderly trial enrollees. We also find that increasing representation of elderly in trials leads to an increase in drug utilization amongst that same group. And exploring mechanisms that link representation to utilization, we find some suggestive evidence that representation improved drug quality as measured by trial precision and drug safety. Now, in terms of contributions, at a broader level, we think of this paper as making three large groups of contributions. First, we provide causal estimates for how shifts in financial incentives shape representation in R&D. This is related to some really excellent prior work that examines how changes in regulatory guidance might influence representation of females in clinical trials. I know this work shows little impact on changes in regulatory guidance on female-focused trials, suggesting that direct financial incentives may be a much more powerful lever than regulatory guidelines. Second, we think of this as complementing existing survey evidence on the relationship between representation and drug utilization. Some recent work shows that representation affects utilization for one underrepresented group, Black Americans. We're going to build on this by confirming their finding using real-world prescription outcomes. And finally, we add a new dimension to our understanding of the relationship between insurance and innovation. Now, prior studies have primarily examined how insurance might influence innovation by shifting expected demand. Now that we're more likely to be covered, we might demand more drugs of a certain type that might lead to impacts on R&D. In this particular paper, we're examining how insurance affects the supply of a key input to the R&D process. Now, before digging into the data and results, let me give you some institutional background on the setting that we're discussing. So typically, drug development begins with preclinical laboratory research that involves testing a new drug candidate in animals and human cells. And once complete, drug manufacture begins the most expensive part of drug development, the human testing of drugs in a series of clinical trials, which increase with costs with each subsequent phase. Drugs that successfully demonstrate safety in phase 1 proceed to phase 2, in which their efficacy is tested in a few hundred participants. If they're successful, then they move on to phase 3, where they test efficacy in an even larger group. And if you're successful, you will ultimately make it to FDA review and approval. And now it's no surprising that this whole process is costly, costing up to around $800 million and long, lasting up to 12 years. And a key driver of these high costs are participant recruitment and retention costs. One published estimate suggests that the average participant recruitment cost can reach up to $330,000 per participant. And drug manufacturers aim to enroll eligible participants quickly due to competition regarding seeking the same patients to enroll in their trials, and also to minimize the high fixed costs associated with extended recruitment periods. Now, before 2000, historically, the cost of patient recruitment and retention were often shared by drug manufacturers and participants. And while there's limited data on the actual allocation of costs and substantial variation across different diseases, drug manufacturers typically cover routine trial expenses and data analysis. And they ultimately bill the insurer for these routine costs. Now, you can think of routine costs as essentially constituting nearly all of the costs except for the cost of the treatment itself. These costs include clinical monitoring, diagnoses and laboratory services, post-surgical care, additional office visits, and the prevention of complications. Now, trial participants, they usually receive a study drug without any cost, but they may bear the costs for routine care if it's been denied by the insurer. They're also responsible in some cases for screening and travel. Now, based on our interviews with clinical trial managers, there was substantial uncertainty about the ultimate financial responsibility associated with clinical trials. There was a widespread impression that some patient costs are simply not covered by Medicare. Clinical trial managers also could not guarantee that Medicare will pay for the costs required and had to disclose this uncertainty to patients fairly early on in the R&D process. I'll also note that Medicare does not routinely pre-authorize care, and they're legally the payer of last resort. And so if Medicare rejects the claim, the participant is responsible. As an aside, most private insurers also excluded coverage of services in clinical trials on the basis that the treatment was investigational or experimental. Now, against this backdrop, policymakers were concerned that the high cost and uncertainty of trial participation could lead to low clinical trial participation and a slowdown of drug development. And so in 2000, the Clinton administration ordered Medicare to start covering the costs of clinical trials for their beneficiaries. Trials had to show a medical benefit, and they focused on routine costs because they constitute a significant share of clinical trial costs. They also tacked on an awareness program for beneficiaries. And the primary aim of these efforts was to reduce uncertainty and costs of elderly trial enrollment for both elderly participants as well as manufacturers. And the goal of this particular paper is to examine how this expansion in insurance coverage, this reduction in costs caused by the Medicare memorandum ultimately shifted trial representation and subsequently drug utilization. So to jump straight into the data that we use data on the universe of clinical trials from the Cortellis Competitive Intelligence Database. For each trial, we have information about relevant diseases mapped to ICD-9 codes, participant enrollment criteria, start date, sponsor, and also the trial results. We're going to be focusing on phase 2 and 3 trials because they constitute a major investment. They're also better reported, and we're going to be focusing on trials run by the private sector because the private sector plays a disproportionately large role in R&D. We are going to incorporate information on clinical trial outcomes or enrollment counts from clinicaltrials.gov, and we're going to be focusing on the years 1995 to 2005 to avoid the direct effects for other policies, most notably Medicare Part D, that was signed in 2003 and ultimately implemented in 2006. I'll also note that our results are robust to restricting our analysis to the 1995 to 2003 period. And this is going to give us a final sample of roughly around 8,000 trial disease observations. Now, here's an example trial record. Here you can see that this is a drug tested on patients with active rheumatoid arthritis. Importantly, we can see when the trial starts in 2000. We see that the trial sponsor or the manufacturer behind this trial was Abbott, and that this is a phase 3 trial. In addition to that information, we also have some detailed information regarding who's actually enrolled and who can actually participate in this trial. And so we can look at the eligibility criteria and see that this trial is opened up to those age 18 and older. And in terms of who they actually enroll, they enrolled around 619 participants, 25% of which were age 65 and older. So for our empirical strategy, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage variation in disease level exposure to the Medicare memorandum. We're going to use data from the Medical Expenditure Panel survey from the pre-period 1996 to 1999, and we're going to construct disease level measures that capture the share of patients that are on Medicare and therefore elderly, and therefore may be more exposed to the policy. And we're going to refer to this as the Medicare share. To give you a sense of the treatment, this shows you the distribution of Medicare shares across different diseases. And so we look at the far left, we have ADHD, and this tells us that amongst individuals with ADHD, the share of individuals that are elderly is low. That means that this disease is going to be less exposed to the Medicare-driven shock, and ADHD is therefore going to have a low Medicare share. That's quite different from Parkinson's. Amongst individuals with Parkinson's, the share that is elderly is high. They're going to be more exposed to this Medicare-driven shock, and Parkinson's therefore has a high Medicare share. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to examine whether there's a greater change in R&D efforts in clinical trials amongst conditions such as Parkinson's relative to conditions such as ADHD. Now, trials are rare in these instances if we're focusing on the disease year level, and also note that our disease measures are fairly detailed. On an average disease year, we observe 1.5 trials that take place. Now, the majority of these trials are indeed open to the elderly, but when it comes to actual enrollment, the share of elderly is actually much lower. And so with this data, we can examine how the Medicare memorandum impacted clinical trials. Now, before we dig into the main analysis, I want to give you a sense of this representation problem. This figure uses data from before 2000. The y-axis represents the share of trial participants that are elderly. X-axis represents the share of the global disease burden that are elderly, so individuals in the population with a disease that are actually elderly. You can think of the global disease burden as our benchmark and each dot as a disease group. Now, if there was perfect representation in trials, all dots would fall along this 45-degree line. But the fact that we observe dots below, all the dots below the 45-degree line suggests underrepresentation. For example, when it comes to prostate cancer, the share of trial enrollees that are elderly with prostate cancer is 31% on average. In contrast, the share of individuals with prostate cancer in the population that are elderly is actually 75. Now, I want to note that one limitation of this comparison is that data on global disease burden is relatively limited before 2000, and so it's not actually going to be used in our main analysis, but it helps provide some suggestive evidence for what representation looked like before 2000, before the policy, and importantly, how it might have shifted. So in this particular figure, I've now also added what the relationship between elderly enrollment and global disease burden look like after 2000. So I'm including information sort of in new data relative to what was shown before. And what we find is that the new estimated slope, as indicated by the red between the elderly disease burden and trial enrollment, shifted closer to this 45-degree line. This is indicating greater parity between disease burden and clinical trial enrollment. I also want to get another piece of evidence and motivating facts. This graph shows the total number of clinical trials over time across different diseases by Medicare share, so based on how exposed we are to the policy. The darker lines are those diseases with a higher Medicare share. Those that are lighter have a lower Medicare share. And the vertical line corresponds to the year before the Medicare policy. And what this figure shows is that a larger increase occurs amongst the darker line, or the diseases with the higher Medicare share, which again provides suggestive evidence that the 2000 Medicare policy shaped clinical trial investments amongst those most likely to be exposed to the policy. So to examine this much more directly, we're going to run a standard different diff specification at the disease year level, where we're going to compare outcomes in disease with a high versus low share of Medicare share before and after the Medicare memorandum. Our primary exposure measure, our variable of interest, is an indicator for a disease with an above median Medicare share. Results are consistent if we use a continuous measure. We're also going to throw in disease fixed effects, year fixed effects, and disease chapter by year trends to account for changes in scientific and commercial opportunities. Now, to jump straight into our initial set of results, what we find is that following the 2000 Medicare memorandum, there's an immediate, significant, and sustained increase in the number of trials in high Medicare share diseases. So on the left, I have the number of clinical trials, and on the right, I have the log number of clinical trials. And this increase corresponds to about a 25% increase in trials. What's notable is that this effect happens fairly quickly, soon after this Medicare memorandum, which we interpret as firms perhaps taking a drug that's already been developed and it's on the shelf, and they're now quickly testing it in a phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trial. And importantly, also, we note that the effect is fairly quick, suggesting that this is happening before other policies are going to kick in, most notably Part D, Medicare Part D, which kicked in around 2003, 2006. Now, in terms of the types of trials that this was being driven by, we see somewhat similar effects amongst phase 2 and phase 3, which is exactly the type of trials that constitute major investments and are ultimately going to lead to regulatory approval. Now, we next want to understand whether the effects of the memorandum are likely to be greater in diseases where the participant enrollment costs might be historically a little bit higher. Now, detailed disease level estimates of clinical trial costs are not publicly available. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use two proxies. We're going to take a look at the average duration of clinical trials and also whether the disease is more associated with outpatient or inpatient, such as hospital care. This is motivated by the idea that longer trials are more likely to incur high patient costs due to the additional testing and monitoring, and that inpatient care, having to actually go into the hospital and stay in the hospital, may be more costly and invasive compared to outpatient care. And we're going to split diseases into those whose average trial duration is above or below the median, and we also examine and split diseases depending on whether they're more likely to be affiliated with inpatient or outpatient care. So the first two columns show that the rate of clinical trials disproportionately increases amongst diseases with longer trials relative to shorter trials. And similarly, the second two columns show that the rate of clinical trials disproportionately increases amongst diseases common amongst inpatient care, so hospital care relative to outpatient care. Now, there are some caveats. Inpatient care and outpatient care is very different, and so the diseases associated with them are very different. And the difference between the coefficients in each pair are not statistically significant, largely due to the really small sample size. Nevertheless, these results are consistent with this view that the memorandum effectively lowered trial costs in diseases that were more likely to face challenges in participant enrollment. Now, we are going to examine whether the memorandum shifted drug manufacturers' patient recruitment priorities and increased the actual quantity of the elderly participants enrolled within each trial. So we're going to start off by focusing on drug manufacturers' patient recruitment priorities. And we're going to do this by examining changes in trial enrollment criteria. We're going to split our sample of trials into two groups, those whose enrollment criteria includes the elderly and those whose enrollment criteria does not. The black line in this figure demonstrates that increased exposure to this memorandum was associated with an immediate and sustained increase in the number of trials that recruited elderly participants or were open to recruiting enrolling elderly participants. And in addition to that, we also want to understand whether the shift in trial recruitment priorities actually translated into a change in the number of actual participants that were enrolled in these trials. And so let me start off by showing what this looked like in terms of the effect on the number of elderly participants per trial. We can see here that after the memorandum, there's essentially a steady secular increase in the number of elderly participants per trial. Notably, we also observe an increase in the number of non-elderly participants in the trials. And in fact, in separate regressions, we can see that the differences are not statistically significantly different. We interpret this as highlighting potential positive spillover effects and complementarities across the trial participant groups, and the fact that lowering the cost for one group led firms to simply conduct larger trials and increase opportunities for both sets of groups. Lowering the cost for one historically costly group allowed us to have more funds to target and recruit both elderly and non-elderly participants. In terms of the estimates that we show here, these are the estimates corresponding to those event studies. And we, in separate regressions, show that this is robust to restricting our analysis to an even shorter period, and also running a horse race with other policies that were happening around the period after, most notably Part D. And taken together, these findings for us suggest that the Medicare memorandum lower the expected costs of enrolling elderly participants. As a result, firms responded by conducting larger clinical trials for high Medicare shared diseases, and this increase in trial size did not occur at the expense of other groups. Although firms expanded enrollment criteria to include the elderly, they actually increased the number of elderly participants as well as the non-elderly. Now, having
Jen, can I
established,
ask you a quick question?
absolutely.
I'm trying to think about like what a policymaker would want, and maybe you're gonna get there, I don't know. But like, would a policymaker wanting to make sure that we know which drugs are good for the elderly, would they want just simply more elderly people in the trial, or would they want more trials that are exclusively on the elderly? Like, I'm trying to think about the trade-off between diversity within a trial and like statistical power to think about within a demographic group within a trial. Like, are these just like, we're not learning anything more about the elderly? But what would be the actual ideal scenario?
Absolutely. So you're touching upon one of the things that we can't say is whether or not, this it's not clear what the best outcome would be, right? Because on the one hand, as we'll show, having more representation could lead to more product adoption. And so if you're worried about the elderly patients being concerned about taking up a drug because there's not enough good evidence, we would want more elderly in the actual trials. On the flip side, in a world where you would have full representation of the entire population in your trials, that wouldn't give you enough power to really say anything about any group at all. And so the optimal point clearly should be somewhere in the middle, but it's not clear to me which direction we would want to go. And I think this is part of the reason why policies aimed at increasing representation, they have been slow to develop, and take-up has also been challenging to develop as well. Because on the one hand, think about it from the firm's perspective. Sure, we want to increase adoption, but we also want precision too. But it's a really great point in sort of highlighting the challenges of how we think about even designing these trials in the first place. Great. So now, moving on to thinking about utilization, a recent literature has suggested that increases in representation in an R&D process may influence product adoption and utilization. Now, the results of clinical trials are often used in marketing materials, and in the marketing materials, firms may highlight increased representation or the safety or efficacy of the drug amongst elderly participants. And so to examine changes in drug utilization, what we're going to do is we're going to move from a disease year analysis to a person year analysis. And we're going to use data from the Medical Expenditure Panel survey to give you a sense of the rate of drug utilization amongst different groups, amongst those amongst the diseases that are associated with the elderly. Naturally, we actually see higher utilization. Elderly are associated with more diseases relative to the low. And in this particular specification, we're essentially going to run this regression at a different specification at the person year level. Here, we're going to, and we move to this specification because it allows us to control for more features, such as person characteristics that might influence drug utilization. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to compare drug utilization amongst the elderly versus middle-aged patients in old versus young diseases with high versus low Medicare share before and after the memorandum. Our primary indicator of interest here is going to be an indicator for whether an individual is over 65 relative to a control group of individuals age 45 to 54. And our main outcome is going to be the number of prescriptions for a person person I in year T in old or young diseases. And so to start off and to give you a sense of how things evolve over time, I'm actually going to show you some results extended to 2010. And I'm going to start off with our control groups. So this figure shows that the memorandum had little impact on drug utilization amongst all age groups in diseases targeting the young, so those with low Medicare share. And we see that there's really little change over this period of time. We see similar little effects if we looked at drugs developed to target diseases amongst that are diseases that are primarily common amongst elderly, but taken up by those middle-aged individuals, so non-elderly patients. However, if we look at drugs specifically developed to treat diseases that have a high Medicare share and are taken by elderly individuals, so older individuals, we see a large increase in the drug utilization. I'll note again that this is the same set of diseases targeted by the policy and involves the same type of participants that experience a greater representation in clinical trials. And again, we see a very steady increase that happens fairly soon. Now, having established an increase in both representation as well as utilization, a natural question relates to what are the mechanisms that drive this relationship? And so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on how increased representation can impact drug utilization through improvements in real or perceived quality. And this, in some respects, is an attempt at getting to what, Melanie, your question is regarding the composition and the precision of what is actually generated in these trials. Now, when it comes to defining drug quality, it's a real challenge to think about drug quality at scale. This is a commonly documented issue in the literature, and so what we're going to do is we're going to use two proxies of drug quality. We are going to examine the precision of evidence generated and the degree to which a drug is matched to users that can safely treat the drug. So we're going to look at the precision of reported clinical trial results, as well as adverse events associated with the drug once it's actually gone onto the market. And on the left, starting off with looking at the precision of results, here on the left, I've categorized and split up trials into those with and without statistically significant outcomes. And what we find is that the memorandum led to an increase in the number of trials producing precise estimates. And in particular, we'd see an increase in the number of trials with statistically significant outcomes increase more than those without statistically significant outcomes. I do want to note that reporting in trial results is fairly low, and so our sample is quite small, and therefore our estimates are noisy in this area. So we do take this as more suggestive rather than definitive evidence. And another measure of quality is the number of drug adverse events associated with the drug after its launch. And so we construct adverse event rates, which is the level of adverse events per 1,000 users. Our adverse data comes from the FDA Adverse Events Reporting System. These are adverse events reported by healthcare professionals, patients, lawyers. Manufacturers that receive this information must report this to the FDA. And our denominator comes from the number from the medical expenditure panel survey, and we use a number of drug users. And what we find is that, and I'll note that this is a specification that is at the drug, age, gender, year, and focusing on the black lines, we see that the adverse event rate amongst the elderly taking drugs for old diseases, so our target group here, declined while adverse events amongst other patients in other drugs did not. Now, this translates into a 21% decline in the adverse events rate. And while I want to caveat this by noting that adverse events, as many forms of reporting data, are often subject to bias, this broadly is consistent with the idea that increase in representation might have led to a decline. Increases in representation in the R&D process may have led to improvements in both the precision of trial estimates as well as the safety of the drugs ultimately being used, which therefore might have translated into increased drug utilization. Now, to conclude, it's well known that novel technologies have the potential to improve health outcomes. And the process of technological development can play an important role in who benefits from this innovation. Increases in representation of target users may lead to data and products that might be more useful for these groups. And our findings show that representation in trials can be shifted by targeted policies that reduce and address financial barriers, and that this might have meaningful effects on drug quality and utilization. Now, while we can't make any definitive statements about overall welfare effects of the Medicare policies, our findings suggest that regulatory policies aiming to improve concordance amongst other social dimensions could have substantial benefits. So I'll note that in January 2022, Medicaid began covering routine costs for trial participants. And so one interesting question would be to see whether or not this might have shifted representation of low-income individuals in the drug development process. Our results more generally suggest that carefully designed policies may effectively address significant and long-standing underrepresentation in the innovation process, which may have substantial benefits. Thanks so much for your time. I'm very much looking forward to Tong's discussion and also to the group discussion that concludes.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. Tong will be discussing.
First, thank you, Melanie and Camille and other organizers for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. So I believe Jen did a great job in presenting the key message of the paper. So let me briefly recap what the paper does and then how the paper achieved the research outcomes they have. So this paper focused on or explored the questions how or the general impact of such kind of increasing consumer representations in the R&D process are going to impact on the innovation outcomes. So the paper narrows down to a very unique setting. I think this is quite clever, trying to focus on the expansion of the elderly representation in clinical trials. And they find actually, indeed, they have the very significant results or impacts on the drug development incentive for the drug developers and also the drug utilization and quality outcomes. So I don't have to convince you that, okay, this paper is very important. As a result, and also the question bears very significant society implications of underrepresentations. So as Jen actually mentioned briefly in the introduction, so the elderly actually, they made up about 63% of the new cancer cases every year in the US, but they only represent around 25% of the participants in related cancer trials. So such kind of underrepresentations of elderly patients actually, and as long as well as some other kind of like the racial or ethnic disparities in the clinical trials. So this can generate huge hurdles for the patients in access the medical advancements or technologies. So to answer that call, so FDA actually a couple months ago, they issued the guidance trying to provide new details regarding the ways we can improve, for example, the representations in clinical trial studies. So maybe this call or this guidance is responding to Jan's research paper. Besides that, so the paper actually used a very clever identification strategist. I like it a lot. So they use these 2000 Medicare memorandums. Basically, this policy shift make the Medicare program start to cover some routine costs in clinical trials. So this greatly reduced the cost, the burdens, both by the drug developers and also the participants. And also, I'm very impressed by the data work in the paper. So they try to link all different kinds of data sets, dive into very specific project level outcomes, including, for example, clinical trials, link them to the drugs. And also, they have detailed information regarding the participants, enrollments, and also, in the end, they can observe or link them to the drug utilizations and also adverse events once the drug got approval by FDA. So to review the empirical design, actually, it's a very standard definitive design. The treated group, you can think about is kind of disease. They have more occurrence among the old people. So they call it elderly disease. And then the control group is more about the disease categories, like for the young group or young patients. And then the key shock, policy shock, is this 2000 Medicare memorandums. As mentioned, the Medicare programs afterwards, they start to reimburse the routine patient costs and also the cost due to Medicare, the medical complications. So before 2000, such kind of routine care, they are generally covered or mostly burdened by the drug sponsors or developers. Some other type of cost also mentioned by Jane, like the screening cost or travel cost, they would be paid or burdened by the patient themselves. So they examine a series of outcomes based on this empirical design, and they find just in terms of the counts of the clinical trials, they increase in the treated group or the elderly disease group after the shock. And also they find the number of trials with enrollments of including the elderly participants also increase in the treated group. So this is the evidence actually after the shock, the firms are responding to increase the representations of elderly patients. And then in terms of the drug utilizations, they find that the elderly patients' utilizations of these elderly drugs actually increase after the shock. And in terms of, they find actually the key channels there, why they are increasing the utilizations actually comes from the quality increase of these drugs. So they show two pieces of evidence. So the counts of the trials in the treated group disease categories, actually the clinical trial results become more precise. And also we witness a reduction of adverse events for the elderly disease drugs after they get FDA approval after the shock. So this is kind of the very brief summary of the key results in the paper, but definitely they have like much richer results in the paper. So I encourage everyone to read it and dive into the more interesting results there. So my discussions actually will be around 3 different points. The first one is about interpretation, and then the second one, somehow related to the first one, is about the drug developers' incentives. So I call this mechanisms, how they are responding to the policy shock. And then the third one is more about the survival bias, actually regarding some outcome variables. So in terms of interpretations, let's come back to the research question actually this paper focused on. So the paper focused on the question how an increasing of the consumer representations in the R&D process are going to impact the outcomes of R&Ds. So let's step back a little bit and think about, to address these questions, we can access all the resources. What's the ideal experiment we should do there? So ideally, we should randomly, just given a set of the trials or the drug projects, we should randomly assign the different levels of elderly participations to the trials, and then see the trial outcomes and associate, like accordingly to see the drug utilizations and the drug qualities after getting approval. So that's kind of the ideal experiment we should aim for. However, this is infeasible to do in the real life. So the paper actually is super clever. They use this quasi natural experiment, the 2000 Medicare memorandum, the policy shift in the Clinton administrations. So the key effects coming out of this policy change is trying to cover majority of the costs for the elderly participants in the clinical trials. So indeed, we witness such kind of big after the shock, we witness like more representations of elderly participants in the trials of the treated group. So this is kind of consistent with the key questions this paper focus on, the increase in consumer representations. But however, if we compare this quasi-natural experiment to the ideal experiment we have in mind, there's such kind of hidden factors here is like they're going to affect dramatically of the firms because now firms are paying less cost in the R&Ds. So why would this matter? So based on this another economic forces because of the reduction of the R&D cost, I can come up with an alternative interpretations. Rather than coming from the increase of consumer representations, all the results actually can naturally come out with such kind of reduction of R&D cost. So for example, because of the R&D cost reductions in all these sort of elderly drug developments process, so on the extensive margins, these are going to attract more drug developers into the areas. And then you will see after the shock, more new drug projects or new clinical trials will be initiated. And they are all targeting the elderly disease. And by default, because they are targeting the elderly disease, naturally, they're going to recruit more elderly participants. So we will see an increase of elderly representations. And then because once they reach the endpoint and get FDA approvals, we'll see more availabilities of such kind of elderly drug in the market. And now the patients, the elderly patients, they have more choices. Now, rather than seeking the help from the young drugs, they can just directly go for the elderly drugs now available in the market. So we'll also see the drug utilizations. So in these stories, basically all the changes in innovation outcomes are somehow driven by the other economic forces due to the reduction of the R&D cost rather than the increase of elderly representations. So I was thinking, would that be a problem? Or anyway, we can somehow just throw out such kind of an alternative stories we may have in mind. So I was thinking or proposing maybe a different design that can map closer to the ideal experiment in the sense that because the key things coming out of these alternative stories is because on the extensive margin, you see more entrants. So we can rule out such kind of new entrants, basically focus on a set of the drugs they initiated before the shock. And then we track all the trial phases, say there are two types of drugs, the young drug Y and old drugs E. And then we track all the trial phases of Y and E. So basically this rule out the extensive margin changes. And then suppose we can observe, I know your paper focused on the phase 2 and phase 3, but suppose the phase 1 of both Y and E drugs, they were happening before 2000, before the policy change. And then the phase 2 or later phases actually happened after the policy change. So suppose the story of increased representations actually have impact, significant impact here. We should expect that the phase 1 of both Y and E drugs, they have no differences in terms of elderly representations before shock. And then the phase 2 of the E of these elderly drugs, we should see more representations of the elderly the elderly participants relative to the young drug. And then you may still argue, some people may still argue, okay, so for the elderly drugs, they still enjoy such kind of financial slack because of the reduction of the R&D cost. So we can do, on top of that, we can do a tighter specifications, basically control for the drug company fixed effect. You're comparing the E drug and Y drugs within the same portfolio of a company. So even the company enjoys such kind of financial slack due to the reduction of the R&D cost, presumably they are going to impact equally of both type of drugs. So, but we suppose we still find some significant results in terms of drug utilizations and also the drug quality outcomes. I think this would be good news. We can tighten up the interpretations to this increase in consumer representation stories there. So related to the first comment, my second comment actually is more about the drug developers' incentives, documented in the paper. So this is also trying to address underlying mechanisms, why firms are responding to the policy change. I believe this is a very interesting question by itself. And currently, the paper sticks to the angles that because of the policy, now the patients they can reduce their participation cost. That's why we see more supply of such kind of patients or clinical trial participants, and this is a good thing. And if we come back to the firm's decisions whether to develop the drugs or not, so it's a very simple binary decisions. What they're calculating is basically to compare the expected revenues versus the cost of developing the drugs, whether it's a positive NPV project or not. And then different factors may be tied to the different components we're discussing here. So the paper right now, they're trying to, they focus on one particular channels or mechanisms is because of the participant supply increase. Now the cost of participating in the clinical trials become lower. But is that possible that such kind of shock are also going to affect the revenues, the expected revenues? Or itself, like the policy itself, like this is another force is actually briefly mentioned in the paper, is direct subsidies to the firms because they don't have to burden all the costs of monitoring or collecting the data or taking care of the patients. So I find it's very helpful to distinguish different incentives of the firms because why? Because this may have some different policy implications in the end. Let's take the example of this revenue, the impacts on revenues, because now firms may think about, okay, if I recruit more Medicare patients, maybe my chance will be included in the Medicare programs later on will be higher. So I can expand my demand base from the consumers. So to examine that channels or incentive, maybe you can check whether drugs indeed, if they include more Medicare patients in the clinical trials, whether it's more likely for them to be covered or included in Medicare programs later on. And then to examine the first cost reduction channel, which is like the direct subsidies to the firm R&D cost, we can directly just check out, for example, the public pharmaceutical firms, their quarterly reports, financial statements, to see whether indeed we witness R&D expenses the reduction in the end. And then the other kind of type of the cost reduction channels or incentive here is more about the patient side or the supply of the participants. Maybe it's just that this induce more supply of the trial participants and reduce the cost of recruiting patients. So for that, maybe the paper can check whether the firms, they change trial size by tilting towards the locations with maybe more potential enrollees, something like that. So why this matters? So in my mind, because these are gonna imply different policy implications. Suppose it's the first one, the revenue incentive. Then for the government, they don't have to give the subsidies to the firms. What they can do is that they can directly announce the policy, say, okay, if you include more elderly participants, I will just give you the priority to include this type of drugs in the Medicare programs. Or the other way is like to increase the supply of trial participants. So in these ways, they can just, without like wasting too much money, they can just somehow do more promotions and marketing in terms of clinical trials, attract the patients to the corresponding trial sites. So my last comments actually is related to like a subset of the outcome variables actually focusing in the paper. So it's more about the drug utilization adverse events, because we can only observe these type of outcomes when they got the FDA approvals. So you can imagine a lot of trials or drug projects, potentially they have lower demand or they have more adverse events somehow throughout the phase 1 to phase 3, they just drop out. So this may generate the survival bias. So for that, actually, I think that the paper can very nicely address that. First, by comparing the characteristics of these dropout drugs versus the approved drugs, and to see whether we see any differences there. And also to account for the survival bias, maybe that you can use the modified specifications like Heckman selection. Even though it's a parametric approach, I can imagine the non-parametric approach is very challenging in this setting. So you just impose some additional assumptions and see whether the results hold. So with that, I think I'm running out of time. So I encourage everyone to read this paper. It's a super interesting paper tackling an important question in R&D and innovations. And also I thank you organizers and also Jane for writing such amazing papers. So giving me the opportunities to share thoughts. Thanks.